I still remember the morning my life veered off its course. It didn't happen with shouting or slammed fists, just a nod and a silence so sharp I could hear the air conditioner hissing through the doorframe. Skylink Broadcasting gleamed under the New York sun like a massive block of ice suspended in midair. That cold beauty fit the company perfectly, polished, razor sharp, and willing to drop anyone if it meant innovating faster. My name is Lena Mercer, 52, lead engineer for satellite signal encryption. I had spent 25 years at Skylink, from the days when our server room sounded like a tractor to the moment we became the nation's top satellite media company. I had repaired systems during hurricanes, taught fresh graduates how not to blow up a server, and worked 3 nights straight until Gary set a warm sandwich in front of me. I tell you that so you understand. I wasn't the kind of name that accidentally lands on a layoff list. I was part of the foundation, and that conference room was nothing more than a stage for a very poorly acted show. The chief executive officer's door opened. Bryce Talbot stood there with the kind of perfect smile you see in glossy business school brochures. 34, crisp white shirt, slicked back hair, and the confidence of someone who had never failed long enough to understand what failure truly meant. People said his parents were the type who never heard the word denied from a bank, and Bryce walked like he owned the entire city. He didn't offer me a seat, so I sat anyway. I don't work for him in a way that requires permission. He turned the big screen toward me. The slide read, "The Future of Skylink." I almost laughed. Anyone who uses the word future too much is usually hiding from the present. He cleared his throat and launched into a speech he had clearly practiced in front of a mirror. We are entering a new phase and restructuring the team to align with our growth strategy. I only heard the 3 words that mattered. You are out. Bryce kept talking about innovation, optimization, vision, all the words people use to mask the fact that they don't want to pay someone their worth. Then came his final line, smooth enough to be memorized. Lena, we've decided to end your contract because you no longer align with our new direction. I looked at him the way you look at a freshman trying to explain an algorithm he memorized, but has no idea how it works. Interesting, I said. No yelling. No why. Silence is the one thing people like Bryce fear most. He handed me an envelope. I took it. Light, thin, 25 years reduced to something that barely weighed anything. When I stood, Bryce tried to smile confidently, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. People who rely on power tend to tremble when they realize power doesn't matter to the person in front of them. I stepped into the hallway. Everyone kept their eyes glued to their screens. In companies like this, silence is a survival skill. HR waited with a second envelope. Her voice was trained to sound neutral. We'll send your offboarding documents within the hour. I nodded. She looked away like I were carrying something contagious. I passed the engineering room. Faces I had stayed up with, night after night, stared at their screens. Some met my eyes, then quickly looked away. Some held their breath. But for a brief moment, almost too quick to be real, Gary stood by the door, arms crossed, and gave me the slightest nod. Wordless, but clear. I know the truth. Outside, the New York wind hit my face. My reflection stared back from the glass. An older woman pushed out of the company she helped build. But instead of rage, all I felt was a strange calm. The kind you find when you finally realize silence can be the sharpest counterstrike. I walked down the steps and watched the crowd rush past. And before we go further, I want to turn to you. Tell me, from which state and city are you listening to this? I want to know how far my story has traveled before we step into the real part, the story of how I reclaimed what they thought I would quietly leave behind. I walked out of the Skylink building and headed down the long stretch along the Hudson River. The wind coming off the water was cold and clean, nothing like the suffocating air inside the company I had just left. I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not feel shattered. All I wanted was a quiet corner to look at the picture that had just shifted in front of me. I chose a small cafe tucked behind a line of trees. The glass door opened with a soft ring of the bell. Inside, the space was warm, with old wooden tables, the smell of dark roasted coffee lingering in the air. I took my usual seat by the window, the one I had used whenever I needed to think clearly. The older waitress recognized me, gave a single nod, no questions. Some days, all you need is the respectful silence of a stranger. I rested my hands on the table and looked out at the rippling water. If this had happened 20 years earlier, maybe I would have felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. But now, after decades of technical storms and meetings, where one mistake could collapse an entire system, I had learned how to stay steady. And I knew one thing very clearly: nothing in corporate life is ever accidental. My firing was not some staffing adjustment dressed up in Bryce's polished language. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, letting my memory arrange the scattered pieces I had quietly picked up over the past months. Bryce had been acting differently. More executive meetings, more talk about a new vision for Skylink, yet no real explanation of what he was aiming for. He seemed more tense every time a board member showed up in the building. A thought flickered through my mind. A man like Bryce only does things for two reasons: money or reputation. And this time he was chasing both, wrapped neatly in one upcoming project. I unlocked my phone and scrolled through the internal emails I still had access to before they shut my account down. The name of that project appeared far more often than I remembered: a major technology demonstration for the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Communications Commission. If that demo succeeded, Skylink would land a multi-year contract worth hundreds of millions. And Bryce, the face of the project, would be hailed as the next rising star of satellite communications. I took a sip of the strong coffee and let the bitter taste settle. The pieces in my mind began to click. Bryce did not fire me because I did not fit the future. He fired me because I was the only person left who understood the core technology he needed for that demonstration. And he did not want the name Lena Mercer appearing on any slide of his grand moment under the spotlight. To Bryce, I was the last trace of the old era he was desperate to erase. I let out a small laugh, not bitter, more like the sound of someone finally seeing the truth with a bit of irony. Maybe Bryce thought brilliance came from slogans, not from 2 decades of wrestling with live systems on the edge of failure. Just listening to him talk made that obvious. He thought shiny words could replace nights I spent in freezing server rooms, trying to stop an entire network from collapsing. The difference between us was simple. I built the thing he was trying to show off. I leaned back, holding the warm cup between my hands. Morning in New York was getting busier. People hurried past the window, unaware that a tiny shift had just taken place in this city. A shift that could shake a company worth billions. My mind drifted to the legal documents Skylink had delayed for years. The meetings where they asked me to sign patent transfer papers, only to postpone them again. The emails from legal say they would finalize everything after fundraising, then after restructuring, then after the next contract. Back then, I thought they were just busy. Now I have realized the truth. They were not busy. They were confident I would never leave. A cold spark ran down my spine, not fear, awareness. The sudden understanding that there was something buried in the old files that Bryce and his young legal team knew nothing about, or maybe knew, but ignored. A detail forgotten in the chaos of Skylink's early years. I set my cup down and leaned forward, fingers interlocked. I was no longer looking at the river. I was staring into something deeper. A memory surfaced, sharp as the sound of keys in the server room long ago. A sealed envelope, a signature, a warning from an old friend. A clause Skylink never completed. My heart thumped once, only once, but it was enough to tell me I had just landed on the most important clue of my entire career. I whispered in my mind, what if they forgot? And if they truly forgot, then young Bryce had just triggered something he had no idea was still alive. I left the cafe as the sun climbed higher, but my mind stayed fixed on the sealed envelope I had tucked away for more than a decade. Thinking back, I realized I had lived long enough inside Skylink to know that every crisis in the present always had roots buried somewhere in the past. And Skylink's past was nowhere near as glamorous as the story it told now. In the early days, Skylink was just a cramped room of engineers, squeezed so tightly together that we had to ask permission to even shift in our seats. The servers crashed so often that we treated it like weather, something to endure. If anyone saw the office lights on at 3 in the morning, they knew one of us was racing to rescue the system. At that time, rumors said a major corporation was ready to buy Skylink for so little that we were one breath away from becoming a cautionary tale in the startup world. It was during that chaos that Alan Rhodes stepped into my life. He arrived as an intellectual property advisor, but he quickly became the one steady pillar in the room. Alan had served in military technical units, so he spoke little, did much, and never exaggerated anything. When he reviewed the early prototype of the encryption algorithm I had just finished, he stayed silent for a long time. Then he said a line I never forgot. "What you built is not a temporary fix. It could be Skylink's future, and the future needs protection." I thought he was overstating things, but then he opened his case and showed me a draft of a provisional patent. Under the inventor and owner section was my name. He explained that the company was too unstable back then. If I transferred full ownership and the company collapsed, my work would vanish as if it had never existed. I hesitated, but eventually signed. Not out of ambition, but because I understood that the technology was the one thing I could still control amid the chaos. A week later, we drafted a special clause. It was blunt to the point of being bold. If the inventor was terminated without legitimate cause, the patent rights would automatically revert to the inventor within 48 hours. Alan said, "You should have a lifeline in case this company turns too fast and forgets who kept it standing." I did not think much of it when I signed, treating it as a simple precaution. Skylink grew, moved into a new building, and hired new faces. Along with that growth came stacks of legal paperwork. The legal department promised to finalize the transfer when they had time, but every time they pushed it to after another project, then after another, and eventually they forgot entirely. I remembered the last time I saw that envelope. The year was 2008. The paper still smelled of fresh ink, the seal perfectly intact. But work swept me along, and the envelope sank to the bottom drawer, becoming a piece of the past no one bothered to touch. Skylink expanded so fast and I became so busy that I completely stopped thinking about the fact that I held the foundation of the company's most critical technology. Only when I was fired so coldly did that forgotten memory surface after more than 10 years. I went home and opened in my safe, spinning the lock 3 times before the combination came back to me. Beneath a pile of old documents lay the yellow envelope, the seal still unbroken. I picked it up. The feeling was strange, like touching my younger self and touching undeniable proof of every sacrifice I once ignored. I turned the envelope over, my fingers brushing the rough paper. I remembered the freezing nights in the server room, the calls at midnight, the races against time to keep the system from collapsing. Holding that envelope, I realized none of Skylink's core technologies had ever been born from Bryce's colorful slides or marketing slogans. They came from the quiet hours no one ever saw. I set the envelope on the table and sat down, taking a slow breath. Bryce believed firing me was a small move in his grand strategy. He had no idea that buried beneath the mountain of documents Skylink tried to control was a single clause they had forgotten. A clause that could flip an entire company on its head. I traced the date, stamped in 2008. Pride and hurt mixed together. Pride in creating something the entire industry respected. Hurt because the company I once called family now wanted to erase my name from the very thing I built. And I said one sentence, soft but sharp enough for the whole room to hear. All right. If they have forgotten, I will remind them. I spent the rest of the morning sitting quietly with that sealed envelope. It felt like holding a beating heart, not from nervousness, but from the weight of everything waiting to be opened. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I could not do this alone, and if there was anyone I needed to see before taking another step, it was Alan Rhodes. Alan had moved to a major law firm in Midtown years ago, yet we kept in touch. I called him early in the afternoon. His voice was the same, low and steady, and with just one sentence, I felt the calm that had grounded me through so many storms. When I told him I needed to meet about something involving Skylink, he simply said, "Meet me in 1 hour." I took a cab to his office building. When I stepped into the small conference room where he waited, I saw that his hair had grown much grayer, but his eyes were still as sharp as the day he handed me the first draft of the patent. He looked at the envelope in my hand and raised an eyebrow, as if he had already guessed everything. I broke the seal in front of him. One sheet at a time, the documents lay on the table under the white overhead lights. Alan read slowly, missing nothing. When he reached the special clause, he paused longer. His eyebrows tightened a little, not from surprise, but calculation. I could almost see the chain of consequences running through his mind. At last, he looked up and set both hands on the edge of the table. "Lena," he said. Do you understand this is not just about a company? This involves the federal government. It is not just a civilian project, it is tied to national signal security. I nodded. I had expected that warning. But hearing it from Alan made the whole thing heavier, more real. I asked whether the clause was still in force. Alan did not answer right away. He stood, pulled a legal reference book from the shelf, flipped to a section, read in silence, then exhaled. The clause is fully valid. No one in Skylink's legal department ever canceled or amended it, and the way they terminated you triggers it completely. A cold draft moved through me, not from the air conditioner, but from the realization that I was standing at the crossroads of a very large storm. Alan watched me with an expression balanced between concern and respect. If you reclaim ownership, Skylink loses all rights to use the algorithm. That means their federal demonstration becomes legally worthless. And if they move forward anyway, it is intellectual property violation. Are you prepared for that? I did not answer at once. I looked at the papers, at the signature I had written over 10 years earlier. Younger handwriting. A little shaky, but full of conviction. The woman who signed that clause had protected her creation. Why should the woman I am now do anything less? I said, my voice steady. I will activate it. Alan nodded. He asked if I wanted him to file the claim on my behalf. I shook my head. This was something I had to do myself, not because I did not trust him, but because I needed to feel the weight of every step. We opened the laptop together. Alan guided me into the USPTO system. My hands did not shake as I typed. Each keystroke felt like writing my life back into place. When I reached the section requiring the reason for activation, my termination met the clause exactly. So exact, it was almost poetic, and a little ironic. I submitted the filing while thinking how strange it was that a company obsessed with the future never bothered to check the legal past. When I pressed send, there was no chime, no dramatic flash. Only a plain confirmation line appears on the screen. But in that moment, I knew I had set a legal gear in motion. A gear Skylink had no idea was waiting. A gear capable of grinding Bryce's arrogance down to dust with a single click. Alan looked at me the way a person looks at someone who has just stepped out of darkness to reclaim what is theirs. He did not congratulate me or warn me further. He simply placed a hand on the documents and said, "You did the right thing." I thanked him, left his office, and headed home. Evening fell over the city like a velvet curtain. I sat by the window and watched the yellow lights blink on across the buildings. New York is always most beautiful at night, when all the ambition and rivalry and anger of the day turn into tiny sparks floating against the dark. I stayed there a long time, my hand resting against the cold glass. I did not feel fear. I did not feel worried. Only a strange calm, like a person who has dropped anchor just before the storm begins. I knew what was coming would not roar at first. It would begin like distant thunder behind heavy clouds, slow, deep, and certain. And I knew Bryce would never see it coming until it was far too late. I knew the filing I submitted would not shake the ground right away. Legal shockwaves rarely explode. They spread quietly, slowly, and usually begin with the people no one pays attention to. And just as I expected, the first person at Skylink to see the storm approaching was not Bryce, not the chief counsel, but an intern. While I sat by the window watching the city turn to evening, Bryce was leading an important meeting on the 26th floor. He stood before a large projector screen, presenting the upcoming demo for the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Communications Commission with the confidence of someone who believed speaking loudly enough could solve anything. Blue slides flashed across the screen. I used to think Bryce chose that shade because it inspired trust. Later, I realized he used it because it looked modern in promotional photos. Around the table sat the engineering team, product leads, and legal staff. Some nodded automatically. Others scribbled notes to seem busy. Next to Bryce was the new chief counsel, the man I knew from our first handshake, who would cause trouble. He spoke with slick confidence, offering promises that sounded more like marketing slogans than legal analysis. He talked about making the company's legal profile look flawless to the federal agencies, a phrase chosen more to please Bryce than to protect anyone. In stark contrast was Harriet Collins, the deputy chief counsel. Silver hair, sharp eyes, and a habit of speaking so directly that Bryce always bristled. I had worked with her for years and knew she never signed a single document without reading every tiny mark. When Bryce finished his presentation, Harriet asked one simple question: Has the patent ownership transfer been updated in the system? The question hit the exact center of the issue, and the room dropped a degree. Bryce smiled, that polished smile he probably practiced in the mirror. He said everything had been taken care of. He did not even bother asking what Harriet was concerned about. The chief counsel immediately chimed in, assuring everything was fine. Naturally, he did not mention when he had last checked, mostly because he likely had no idea where to even find the filing. But Bryce heard what he wanted to hear and nodded as if the matter were settled. While those two brushed off the warning, downstairs in the legal department, Austin, the youngest intern, was reviewing the company's patent list, a task that leadership believed was too simple for anyone more senior. He entered the file reference and waited for the system to respond. When my name appeared under owner, his eyes widened. He erased it and typed again. The same result. Maybe he hoped the site had glitched, but the USPTO rarely makes mistakes. Austin grabbed his laptop and sprinted to the meeting room. Bryce was in the middle of outlining a communication strategy when Austin knocked. I could picture Bryce's face tightening in annoyance. The intern handed the laptop to the chief counsel, voice trembling. The chief counsel froze, then attempted a strained smile. He claimed it must be a system error and handed the laptop back as if the discovery meant nothing. Bryce glanced over and said something perfectly in character. Systems glitch sometimes. We will check later. Continue the meeting. Harriet looked at Bryce as though watching a man walk down a staircase without looking at his feet. But she said nothing. Years in law had taught her that arrogance has a way of pulling its own chair out. The meeting ended under a thin layer of false calm. Bryce walked out triumphant, the chief counsel trailing behind. Austin remained in the hallway, clutching the laptop, worry etched across his face. He knew he had seen something big, and more importantly, he knew the only person who could explain it was the one who had just been pushed out of the company. I was pouring a cup of hot tea when my phone vibrated, a message from Gary Thompson. Gary was the kind of man who stayed exactly the same no matter how many executives came and went, keeping his work ethic as steady as the old winter jacket he always wore. The message had only one sentence: One day, they will know who truly kept this company standing. I stared at that line for a long time. It did not urge me to fight back. It did not sound dramatic. It was simply a quiet confirmation from someone who had seen everything over the last 20 years. A reminder that real value never came from Bryce's speeches or pretty slides. It came from the nights we refused to leave the office until the system held. I set the phone down and leaned back. Outside, the early evening wind swept between the tall buildings. Yellow lights blinked on as the city settled into its usual rhythm. I knew that inside Skylink, things were shifting in ways they had not yet noticed. Tiny cracks were spreading under Bryce's polished confidence. Chaos always arrives like that. No sirens, no warnings. It starts as something someone calls a minor system bug. Then it slips into meetings, shaking loose the rehearsed nods. Then it lingers in the worried eyes of a young intern who has just seen a truth far larger than his role. And I, the one who tilted the entire wall with a single click, simply sat still, calm as if nothing had happened, because I knew the real storm was still offshore, and Skylink was standing directly in its path. I got the first message from a former Skylink colleague around midday. It said only one line: They have started. I set my phone down, poured more coffee, and kept sitting by the window, letting everything unfold exactly the way it was meant to. Even though I was not in Washington, I could picture every detail because I knew Bryce's presentation style too well, and because the people who still respected me quietly sent updates as they happened. The demo took place in a polished auditorium, high ceilings, warm yellow lighting, sound engineered to perfection, the kind of stage built to crown Bryce Rutherford as the new face of satellite communications. He walked out with the certainty of a man convinced today would be his coronation. Gray suit, carefully slicked hair, shoes polished enough to catch the lights. Bryce adjusted the microphone and smiled with that over-rehearsed confidence I suspected he practiced more than once in front of a mirror. He began with his usual solemn tone, emphasizing that the technology they were about to present was Skylink exclusive. He repeated that phrase so often it sounded like a mantra, each repetition claiming ownership over work that had never been his. I listened to the recordings my colleagues sent, calm and a little curious about when the first rupture would appear. The first person to recognize the truth was not a technician, nor Skylink leadership. It was a representative from the Department of Homeland Security sitting in the front row, checking email on his phone while Bryce spoke about the core of the encryption algorithm. In his inbox appeared an email with no title and no message, only an attachment. He opened it. No one noticed except the person sitting beside him, who caught the subtle change in his expression. Moments earlier, he had looked relaxed. Now his eyes turned cold and sharp, the look of someone who has found an unacceptable flaw. On his screen, the words were unmistakable. Owner, Lena Mercer. Beneath it was the timestamp. There was no room for doubt. He stood up, no apology, no explanation. He simply rose and walked out. Bryce did not see it, but the silence created when a federal official leaves mid-event is impossible to ignore. A few people glanced at each other, trying to understand what was happening. Minutes later, the representative from the Federal Communications Commission also left. Then, two executives from major telecom networks. They had received the same email, opened the same file, and reacted the same way. Walk out immediately. Those in the back could not see clearly, but the front rows stirred. Bryce tried to maintain his composure. He assumed they had been called away urgently, so he kept talking, forcing a smile he could no longer hold steady. A Skylink staff member sitting in the back row sent me a message. Bryce is starting to stutter. I smiled, not out of simple vindication, but because justice sometimes arrives in the quietest way. When the investors from New York began receiving the same email, the disruption spread. They did not leave right away, but they phoned their attorneys on the spot. The next minutes were filled with the soft scraping of chairs, puzzled looks, and hushed conversations. And on stage, Bryce tried to keep the narrative intact, but his voice wavered. He slowed down. He made mistakes. A few attendees shook their heads, as if realizing they were watching a man slip on a slope with no traction. When Bryce repeated Skylink's exclusive for the third time, a DHS official returned. He walked toward the stage and quietly informed the event coordinator that they could not remain at an event where the ownership of the technology had not been legally confirmed. His voice was low, but clear enough for the front rows to hear. One person turned to another, and the awareness spread like a silent wave. Bryce heard half the sentence. He froze, eyes widening as if someone had splashed cold water on him. He looked toward the control booth, hoping someone would reassure him that this was a misunderstanding. But no one stepped forward. No one explained. No one was willing to lie anymore. The demo shut down without an announcement. No one came on stage. The technicians powered off the projector without being asked. The lights remained bright, but the room thinned quickly. The important people were already gone. The rest hurried out as if trying to leave a room where a crack had just appeared in the ceiling. A colleague sent the final message. The entire hall is collapsing like a ship hitting an iceberg. No one can save it. I set the phone aside. Outside the window, the sky had deepened into a dark blue. I wondered what Bryce was thinking as he watched the presentation he had built his future on fall into absolute silence. Maybe he was searching for excuses. Maybe he was blaming someone. But he certainly was not thinking about the simplest truth, that everything began with one clause he chose to ignore. And I sat there, calm, watching the city light up, knowing this was only the beginning. Early the next morning, the first message I received came from a friend in Manhattan's finance world. She wrote only 2 words. It fell. I opened the market app. The Skylink stock chart dropped like a stone, sheared off a cliff. The price line plunged almost straight down, leaving behind a thick red streak that looked like a wound too deep to close. Beneath the chart, angry investors argued, panicked traders speculated, and a few threatened lawsuits. I sipped my coffee and felt no triumph. I felt regret, because I knew Skylink could have gone far if it had not been steered by someone who loved the spotlight more than the work. When the stock fell a few more points, Bryce reacted the way I expected. He hired a major law firm in Washington, a predictable move. Their lawyers sent a formal accusation claiming I had withheld intellectual property and intentionally harmed the company. The document was full of threatening language but missing something essential: basic legal sense. Alan read it and laughed. Not loudly, not for long. The quiet laugh of someone seeing something painfully obvious. He said only one line. They did not even read the original clause. I replied with a short email, attaching the old clause exactly as written. Then came silence from Skylink. No argument, no rebuttal. A strange quiet that meant they realized they had already lost the first round. By late afternoon, Skylink's desperation showed up at my door. A man in a crisp suit, hair slicked back, carrying a brand new leather briefcase. He introduced himself with unnecessary softness, then said they hoped to resolve everything peacefully. His courtesy was thin. Every sentence carried the scent of fear. He explained that my decision had put the company in a difficult position, that Bryce was under immense pressure, and that if I continued to stay firm, many people would suffer. Then he lowered his voice, adding a hint of warning. Skylink could take aggressive measures. I should think about long-term consequences. His tone felt like someone trying to pull me into a dark corner where only bad compromises waited. I let him finish. Then I looked straight at him and said the first sentence. I did not take anything from the company. I kept only what I created. He flinched slightly but forced a smile. I said the second sentence. If you want to talk about reputation, start by telling the truth. He stared at the floor for a few seconds. I said the last sentence. And if you plan to use aggressive measures, choose one that does not break the law. 3 lines. Polite, not loud, but sharp enough to cut. He stood, mumbled a few empty words, and left. When the door closed, I saw a familiar expression. The fear of someone standing on the wrong side, simply because they assumed that side had more power. That night, the press surrounded Bryce. Tech sites opened with icy analyses. Business papers ran legal expert interviews, all with headlines that stung. Why does Skylink not own its own technology? Reporters chased Bryce everywhere, some following him all the way to his car. A former colleague messaged me saying Bryce looked like a man lost inside his own career. I found it both funny and a little sad. Soon after, the board held an emergency meeting. The people who once applauded Bryce avoided saying his name. One board member called his disregard for legal procedure a serious failure of responsibility. Another worried the government would see the issue as a security risk. I heard the meeting did not last long. No one defended Bryce. No one had a reason left. A message came from a longtime employee after the meeting ended, and it made me pause for a few seconds. He said, Lena, they are removing Bryce's image from the internal materials. I think he is about to be replaced. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. The feeling was hard to describe. Not victory, not anger released, just a long quiet where I remembered the nights I stayed until dawn to keep a system alive. I remembered the deadlines, the exhaustion, and the belief that the company could become something good. And it was difficult not to feel bitter seeing everything pushed to the edge because of a man who believed power allowed him to ignore the people who built the foundation. But I also knew this. I did not destroy Skylink. Bryce did, when he forgot that technology is built by people, and people deserve respect. I did only one thing I had every right to do. I reclaimed what was mine. In the hours that followed, Skylink unraveled. Executives avoided reporters. Employees did not know whom to trust. Lawyers fell silent, as if they had run out of explanations. And I realized everyone was circling around a truth they had not yet faced. This storm did not come from me. It came from the years they spent dismissing the person who built their backbone. And as I looked out the window at the sunset stretching across the river like a tired ribbon of gold, I thought only one thing. This was not my battle. It was the natural consequence of a promise left unkept for 20 years. After a night full of messages and calls, Alan sent me a short update. The board did not sleep. They met through the night, and he described the session with 3 words: organized chaos. They finally saw what Bryce never allowed himself to acknowledge. A legal fault line is widening across the glass. The federal contract could freeze. Shareholders could revolt. And if the government believed Skylink had hidden ownership, the fallout would be worse than losing money. I could hear the exhaustion in Alan's voice, the kind only felt by people forced to speak truth to those unwilling to hear it. He said they wanted to meet me the next morning. I said no. I told him that before meeting me, they needed to read one email. Then I wrote it. The subject line had one word: terms. In the message, I did not explain anything. I listed 6 conditions, each set exactly where it needed to be, clear as stones laid on a straight path. Condition 1: $20 million, paid immediately upon signing. No installments, no delays. The number was not for them to buy what I created, but to compensate for 20 years spent in the wings while others took the stage. Condition 2: 10% long-term royalty on every contract using the algorithm. No expiration, no adjustment. I chose that number not to crush them, but to force respect for the foundation they had built upon without understanding. Condition 3: one board seat, with full voting power, not symbolic, not honorary. A seat to ensure engineering would never again be treated like background noise behind decisions chosen for aesthetics. Condition 4: official authorship recognition. In legal filings, in partner materials, in federal presentations. Truth does not change because someone dislikes it. Condition 5: a funded training program for senior women engineers in communications and encryption. Real budget, real planning, not a slogan on a wall. A program I once wished existed for me, now built from the company's own oversight. Condition 6: Bryce Talbot must resign immediately. No reassignment. No end of quarter transition. Complete departure from Skylink. Not out of retaliation, but because you cannot rebuild a foundation while keeping the person who cracked it. I read the email once more before sending. No additions. No justification. A creator does not owe explanations to those who forgot how creation works. Less than an hour later, Alan called. He said my email had been printed and read aloud in the boardroom. One board member asked if I was serious. Alan answered, "She has never joked about intellectual property." The room fell silent. The next morning, I arrived at Alan's office at the agreed time. 3 board members were already waiting. None carried the arrogance of people who once believed they controlled every piece on the board. They looked like people who had learned the real board was somewhere else entirely. I sat. They opened the printed copy of my email. No one asked why the terms were so high. They asked one thing: which condition would you like to clarify first? I answered. None requires clarification, but if you have questions, I will respond. One asked about the training fund. I answered plainly. If Skylink wants to make things right, start by opening doors for the women this industry has overlooked far too long. The room quieted. No one argued. No one needed to. 10% royalty came next. They whispered among themselves for a few minutes, then nodded. They knew they had no ground to bargain. They did not have the technology. It was that simple. When they reached the final condition, the chairman looked up at me. He asked, "You truly want Bryce gone immediately?" I replied. "If Skylink wants to rebuild its foundation, it must remove the part that is rotting. And that part is not the technology." The room stayed silent for nearly 10 seconds. If silence had a sound, it would have been steel cables pulled to their limit. Finally, the chairman said, "We understand." Alan began reviewing the legal specifics. I let him handle that. I did not need to push. I simply watched the faces of people who once believed they stood above everyone else, and now knew they had no choice left. When the meeting ended, none of them offered excuses. None said Bryce tried. None said they were unaware. None claimed the company had been too busy to sign paperwork all those years ago. They just stood, signed the documents, and accepted every term. Not because they wanted to, because the truth was too clear to deny. I left Alan's office when the morning had already advanced. The Hudson River wind swept through the street, carrying the clean feeling of something washed away at last. I paused for a few seconds, breathing deeply, not proud, not excited, just aware that everything had finally aligned. And for the first time in years, I stepped forward without needing to look back. I returned to Skylink on a morning without whispers or frantic footsteps in the hallways. The building felt like someone waking up after a long storm. No reporters, no chaos, just the quiet steadiness of a company relearning how to stand. The elevator opened onto the engineering floor. People looked up. Then one person stood, then another, then the whole room. No one shouted my name, no roaring applause. Just a simple rise and a modest round of clapping, the kind that feels like a welcome given to what has finally been put back where it belongs. I nodded in return. There was nothing to say because the air already carried every word. Gary stood by the window, his silver hair catching the morning light. He walked over and said one line, only one. I knew you would come back. The ones who build the foundation do not disappear easily. I smiled. Gary always understood the truth without the need for long explanations, maybe because he had seen Skylink survive all those years on the strength of a technology too many people treated as a free miracle. Bryce was nowhere to be found. They said he slipped out through a back entrance in the early morning. No goodbyes, no box of personal things, just gone, like a burned out bulb. No noise, no flare, simply out. A week later, I sat in the boardroom. No suspicious stares, no empty confidence. They sat upright, looking like people who had finally learned where real value was born. I spoke plainly about what needed rebuilding: technical credit protocols, ethical standards, legal compliance for every product. No one objected, no nervous pen twirling, no empty corporate cliches. Then I introduced the training fund for senior women engineers. I told them about the experienced women pushed into administrative roles because they did not fit some idea of company image. I said, "We will fix that, not for headlines, for a real opportunity." The room went quiet, not from surprise, but from acceptance. Some mistakes people do not face until they cannot escape them anymore. After the meeting, I walked through the younger engineering teams. They asked questions, shared projects, and for the first time in years, I saw excitement instead of fear. They said my return made them believe that engineers did not always have to be pushed behind the curtain. I made no grand promises. I told them only, "Your work is finally being seen, so stop doing it as if you need to hide." In the following weeks, Skylink shifted step by step. No loud announcements, no grand speeches, just details being put back where they belonged. Engineers credited in partner documents, legal review restored. Projects are no longer trimmed down, so a director could get their name in the press. That quiet correction was what kept the company standing. In one meeting, a board member joked, if Bryce were still here, he would call an emergency meeting to strategize the branding crisis of his personal image. The room burst into laughter. Not cruel laughter. The laughter of people realizing they had just escaped a chapter where seriousness was turned into theater. I left that meeting feeling like everything had settled into the right places again. Not because I had a board seat, not because I had secured the terms I deserved, but because Skylink no longer revolved around the people craving the spotlight. It revolved around the people who built the stage in the first place. I stood by the glass on the top floor and looked out at the city. The buildings below shone the same way they always had, but somehow the light looked different, maybe because I was seeing it with the eyes of someone who had regained what belonged to her without breaking anything in the process. If you have stayed with me this far, maybe you understand this kind of justice too. No door slamming, no shouting, no theatrical revenge, just quiet decisions, sharp enough to cut steel. And if you want to hear more of these stories, I invite you to follow the channel. I have many left to tell. Calm stories, yes, but never dull, because they should have been told long ago.